Most Star Wars videos will tell you Darth Bane betrayed the rule of two, that he spent decades constructing the perfect mechanism for Sith succession, then got scared of dying and tried to wriggle out of it. That the man who tore down an entire Sith army and rebuilt the Order from scratch couldn't follow his own rules when his number came up. Bane didn't betray the rule of two. Zanna did. To make that case properly, we go directly to the source. Drew Karpyshyn, lead writer on Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic at BioWare in 2003, later lead writer on Mass Effect and Mass Effect 2, wrote the Darth Bane trilogy across 3 novels. Path of Destruction, published September 2006, Rule of Two, December 2007, Dynasty of Evil, December 2009. 3 books spanning roughly 1,000 years of in-universe Sith history, constructed as a single coherent philosophical argument about power, succession, and what it costs to build something designed to outlast you. Every claim in this video is grounded in those novels, and in Karpyshyn's own post-publication statements about how Dynasty of Evil resolves. That foundation matters, because the conventional reading of Bane as a coward collapses under even a careful first pass of what the Rule of Two actually says. Not as a slogan printed on merchandise, but as a living philosophical system with internal logic and a specific succession mechanism. Once you understand that mechanism on its own terms, Zanna's behavior in Dynasty of Evil looks less like a triumphant succession and more like the first crack in a 1,000-year structural lie. He was born Dessel on the planet Apatris around 1026 BBY. Not into power, not into philosophy, into cortosis mines. From approximately age 16, he worked those shafts under the Outer Rim Ore Works Company, a corporate extraction operation where wages were paid in company credits, and the options for leaving narrowed quickly to debt or death. Cortosis is worth understanding. It's one of the few materials in the galaxy capable of temporarily shorting out a lightsaber blade on contact. An entire planet of the stuff, extracted by what amounted to indentured labor. Before Dessel understood anything about the Force, he understood what power looks like when it's organized specifically to keep you powerless. Picture the physical reality of those mines, not as metaphor, but as the literal environment that shaped everything Dessel became. Heavy extraction equipment grinding against cortosis seams in the rock, the air thick with mineral dust that coated the lungs and settled in the hair, the specific kind of exhaustion that compounds across years rather than days. Wages that theoretically belong to the worker, but functionally belong to the company ledger first. Dessel was bigger than most of the men around him, stronger, with a capacity for tactical reading of situations that had nowhere useful to go in a mineshaft. He'd been there roughly 10 years before the war found him. A decade of watching supervisors take credit for productivity they hadn't generated. A decade of operating inside a hierarchy that existed specifically to extract value from the people doing the actual work and route it upward to people doing considerably less. Whatever Force sensitivity he carried in those years, he didn't have a framework for it. The Force wasn't vocabulary he possessed yet. What he had was the growing, specific awareness that the structures around him were less capable than they pretended to be, and that he was constrained by them anyway. He didn't volunteer for the Sith. The Sith found him. During the New Sith Wars, a prolonged, grinding conflict that dragged roughly 2 centuries of galactic history into intermittent catastrophe, a military force called the Brotherhood of Darkness was fighting the Republic, and Dessel ended up in its ranks. The Brotherhood of Darkness was a Sith organization, not republic, not mixed allegiance, not ambiguous. This distinction has been gotten wrong in other coverage of this material, and it matters enormously for understanding everything that followed. Because Bane's intellectual journey from foot soldier to Sith architect makes no sense unless you understand who he was serving and what he was watching from inside. His unit was called the Gloomwalkers. He held the rank of sergeant. The unit's nominal commanding officer was a lieutenant named Ulabor, a man who collected formal credit for tactical successes that Dessel generated. The Gloomwalkers campaigned across Kashyyyk, Trandosha, and Fasira during roughly 1003 to 1002 BBY, and Dessel was functionally in operational control even when the victory reports named Ulabor. Every time the Gloomwalkers came out of a fight intact or better, the official record attributed it to the man who outranked the man who actually made the decisions. Dessel already understood, at the level of daily professional experience, how an institution could take power and redistribute it to the wrong people. The Brotherhood of Darkness was doing it to him personally, and simultaneously doing it to the entire Sith tradition by giving every Sith Lord equal formal status, regardless of capability. At the Battle of Fasira, he led the Gloomwalkers to victory immediately after being temporarily blinded by a flash grenade. The court-martial proceeding that followed a subsequent mutiny charge was interrupted before it could conclude. Sith leadership intercepted the case, recognized what they had, and redirected Dessel to the Sith Academy on Korriban. He didn't choose the academy, he was chosen for it. What arrived at Korriban was someone who had spent years watching a military hierarchy that should have been lethal, operating instead as a bureaucracy of competing egos, and who had already arrived at the question that would define his entire philosophical legacy. What organizational structure produces the strongest possible outcome with the least dilution of power? The Academy's answer to that question, preserved in ancient Sith holocrons and in texts like the historical compilations of Freedon Nad that appear in Rule of Two, was more sophisticated than anything the Brotherhood's current leadership was using. Korriban held records stretching back centuries, teachings, techniques, philosophical frameworks from Sith practitioners who had operated in an era before Khan's egalitarian compromise degraded the tradition. Bane absorbed those records against the backdrop of watching the Brotherhood's daily operations, and the contrast wasn't subtle. He'd been handed the Sith tradition's full depth and was simultaneously watching its living representatives run it into the ground through internal politics. He also earned a designation at Korriban that carries weight for the full argument. Bane was identified as the Sithari, the prophesied perfect Sith being, not just another talented practitioner, but the figure the entire tradition had pointed toward as its pinnacle. Whatever he built afterward carried that designation. The Brotherhood of Darkness had been assembled by a Sith Lord named Skir Khan, who reorganized warring Sith factions in the final decade of the Republic Dark Age into a single, unified force. Khan's organizing principle sounds reasonable in outline. No supreme Dark Lord over the others, all Sith equal in title and standing. Every Sith a Lord. Nobody formally above anyone else. Bane's critique of this arrangement holds up under examination. A system where all Sith are nominally equal is a system where all Sith are effectively competing for informal dominance, because power doesn't distribute equally just because the org chart says so. The Rule of Two novel describes the Brotherhood's philosophy from Bane's perspective as the tarnished New Sith philosophy. Not a different, valid interpretation of Sith tradition, but a dilution of it dressed as solidarity. What the Brotherhood produced in practice was constant internal friction, energy spent on positioning, politics, and mutual undermining, rather than on accumulating genuine strength. The Jedi had been grinding the Sith down for centuries, and from Bane's vantage, the reason wasn't that the Sith were inherently weaker. The Sith had numbers, military infrastructure, force practitioners of real capability. What they didn't have was organizational coherence. Every internal political dispute was a tax on their collective power. The Seventh Battle of Ruusan, around 1000 BBY, provided the blank slate Bane's philosophy needed. Khan deployed a thought bomb, a weapon of catastrophic, dark-side destructive force that killed Force sensitives regardless of allegiance, consuming both the Brotherhood's ranks and much of the Republic's Army of Light simultaneously. Khan's weapon killed Khan. The man who had assembled the Brotherhood of Darkness died to the Brotherhood's own most powerful instrument. Bane wasn't inside the bomb's radius when it detonated. He was the sole Sith survivor. That moment bears the full weight of what follows. The organization that had trained him, sent him to Korriban, given him access to ancient Sith philosophy at its full depth, the entire Sith faction, was gone in a single blast. No hierarchy to navigate, no internal politics to survive, no competing lords to outmaneuver. Just the ruins of Rusan, and a galaxy with no Sith in it, except one man, standing in the smoke, holding everything the tradition had ever produced, with absolute freedom and absolute necessity simultaneously landing on him for the first time in his life. The rule of two that emerged from that devastation wasn't a panicked contingency. It was the answer to a question Bane had been building toward for years, finally implemented at the only moment when circumstances matched the solution. The Brotherhood had proven, through its own annihilation, that the many Sith model was self-defeating. Bane designed the replacement to be structurally incapable of repeating that failure. Dynasty of Evil captures the logic precisely. Bane's rule of two ensured that the power of both master and apprentice would grow from generation to generation. Not maintained at current levels, not preserved, growing. Each succession designed as proof that the new Dark Lord is measurably stronger than the one they replaced. On the planet Ambria, a world Karpyshyn would bring the trilogy back to at its end, Bane found his first apprentice. A girl whose instinctive connection to the dark side he recognized as rivaling his own, described in Path of Destruction as possessing an instinctive link to the dark side that rivaled his own. He named her Darth Zanna. The rule of two's lineage began on Ambria. It would face its first real test and its first philosophical failure on Ambria. The rule's famous formulation, two there should be, no more, no less. One to embody power, the other to crave it. That's the condensed version. The mechanics run considerably deeper than a two-line creed. The rule's purpose wasn't only to limit Sith numbers. It was to build a succession mechanism that functioned as an evolutionary selector, a system guaranteeing each generation of Sith was stronger than the last, compounding power forward through time, rather than diluting it across competing practitioners. Karpyshyn gives Bane a second formulation that expands the scope. One Sith must contain all the power of the dark side, so that the rule of two can be transformed into the rule of one. Two Sith as a moving vehicle toward an endpoint, the accumulation of all Sith power in a single being across successive generations. Each master-apprentice pairing wasn't a static arrangement. It was a ratchet. It only moved one direction. The succession mechanism is the challenge. The apprentice absorbs the master's full knowledge, trains against the master's full capability, and when they judge themselves strong enough to win, they issue the challenge. They kill the master. They become Dark Lord of the Sith, take their own apprentice, and the sequence repeats. The master, dying to an apprentice capable of defeating them, isn't a failure of the system. It's the system working exactly as designed. The master who trained a replacement powerful enough to kill them has succeeded at the rule's most fundamental objective. The question the entire argument turns on: does the rule require the challenge to occur against the master at the master's peak capability? The novels don't state this as an explicit written condition. The rule places the timing decision with the apprentice's own judgment of readiness. But the rule's evolutionary logic depends entirely on the duel producing a meaningful result. A meaningful result requires that what gets tested is the apprentice's raw power against the master's raw power. If the timing is manipulated, if the apprentice deliberately waits for the master's decline, engineering the gap between their capabilities so that the duel's outcome becomes calculable before it begins, the test doesn't validate succession, it validates strategy. A philosophically significant difference exists between "I was strong enough to kill my master" and "I waited until my master was weak enough that killing him became achievable." The rule of two, as an evolutionary mechanism designed to produce escalating power through each generation, is only coherent if those two statements describe the same event. Zannah's behavior in Dynasty of Evil suggests they don't. Rule of Two, the second novel, captures Zannah at a formative moment, declaring to Bane that one day she will surpass him, and on that day she will kill him. But that day isn't today. It sounds like the confident assertion of a future Dark Lord who understands the rule's succession logic and is working toward it on the rule's terms. Read it again in light of approximately 2 decades of continued apprenticeship that follow, and that declaration carries a different weight entirely. Zanna spent roughly 20 years as Bane's apprentice without formally challenging him. The rule places the timing decision with the apprentice, so there's no explicit calendar violation embedded in the novels. Bane built a system where the apprentice chooses the moment. Nobody violated the literal terms of the rule's timing clause. The physical context for when Zanna finally acts, however, isn't neutral, and the novels don't permit the reader to pretend otherwise. Bane's body, by the time Dynasty of Evil opens, is showing what the text explicitly describes as undeniable evidence of deterioration. The orbalisks, parasitic organisms that cause constant pain and multiply across the body, had been part of Bane's physical history during an earlier chapter of his life. Their legacy compounded against biological aging. Dynasty of Evil opens with a Bane who isn't the Bane who stood alone at Ruusan. He is older, damaged by years of parasitic infestation, and the gap between his declining capability and Zanna's trained capability has been closing steadily in only one direction. The novel contains what functions as the thesis of the philosophical betrayal case, stated in Bane's own internal reckoning. He considers whether Zanna intended to challenge him only after he was crippled. One sentence, written in Bane's perspective, the architect of the Rule of Two entertaining the explicit possibility that his own apprentice's strategic patience isn't patience at all. It's the selection of favorable conditions. The man who designed the Rule of Two suspects, in the pages of the third novel, that the succession is being gamed. He doesn't react to this with fury. He doesn't call Zanna out directly in the manner of someone confident in their position. He seems to have been watching for years, assessing, probably recalibrating his read of her intentions across each passing season. His awareness of the dynamic is written into the text. His failure to confront it directly might itself be a product of declining position. The master who was once certain of his superiority, growing less certain as time and deterioration shift the physical balance between them. Think through what that watching would have looked like from inside Bane's experience across those 20 years. A master whose apprentice has trained to exceptional capability, but hasn't challenged him. A master who built a system specifically designed to produce that challenge as its defining moment. Watching his student grow into a practitioner of real power, the dark side arts, Sith sorcery, the accumulated weight of everything he taught her, and also watching her continue to not act on it. The declaration from Rule of Two ringing in his memory against the daily reality of her continued deference. At what point does a master who built a succession mechanism around the premise of the apprentice's initiative start to wonder whether the initiative will ever come? At what point does patience on the apprentice's part start to look, from the master's side of the relationship, less like readiness being built and more like readiness being hoarded? Dynasty of Evil's text gives Bane that exact thought. He's there. He's seen it. There is an additional layer that compounds the philosophical problem before a single blow is struck. By Dynasty of Evil, Zanna has already taken her own apprentice, Darth Cognus. This recruitment happened before Zanna formally challenged Bane. Under the Rule of Two, always exactly two, never more, never less. The introduction of Cognus means there are now 3 active Sith in the equation the rule was specifically designed to prevent from having more than 2 members. Zanna is simultaneously Bane's apprentice and Cognus's master. She has claimed the master's role before completing her own succession. The philosophical violation isn't only the head count, it's what the act signals about Zanna's internal accounting. Taking an apprentice is the prerogative of the Dark Lord of the Sith, the master's role, the master's decision, the master's responsibility. Zanna made that decision while Bane still held the title. She was operating as though the succession had already occurred, propagating the lineage forward before she had earned the right to do so within the rule's own terms. She assigned herself the master's authority before defeating the master. The Rule of Two was built on the premise that raw power determines succession, and that the succession determines legitimacy. Zanna separated those two things. She claimed authority before the duel arrived to confer it. That's not the rule working as designed. That's an apprentice who decided the outcome before the test confirmed it. Before arriving at Ambria, the conventional argument against Bane deserves a direct dismantling, because it's the load-bearing wall under the Bane betrayed the rule reading. In Dynasty of Evil, Bane acquires the technique of essence transfer from the holocron of Darth Bane, an ancient Sith who had preserved his knowledge specifically to extend his influence beyond death. The technique is Sith alchemy at its most extreme, projecting one's consciousness into a host body and displacing the host's own mind. Bane hadn't invented it. He found it in Undeadu's records and learned it as a technique, the same way he had spent his entire career studying ancient Sith knowledge and extracting what was usable. This is consistent with how Bane had operated from the beginning, finding what the tradition had produced, evaluating it against his own philosophical framework, and incorporating what survived that evaluation. Bane had also already constructed his own holocron, described in Dynasty of Evil as containing the sum of all Bane's knowledge. The man who supposedly panicked at the thought of dying had already committed the complete architecture of his philosophical and practical knowledge to a durable external record before the final duel. His teachings would survive him regardless of what happened on Ambria. He wasn't facing death with empty hands and a desperate gamble. He'd already ensured that the intellectual substance of what he'd built would persist into Zannah's tenure and beyond. Essence transfer offered something different from knowledge preservation. That was already done. What it offered was the survival of the knower, Bane's own consciousness continuing into the next phase of Sith history, inhabiting a new body, presumably the most capable body currently available to him. The conventional argument? Bane built a system requiring the master to die in succession, then tried to escape that requirement through Sith alchemy. Fear of death dressed as philosophy. Proof that the man who designed the rule couldn't actually live, or die, by it. 3 novels of evidence contradict the fear-based reading. The man who, from age 16, had operated in environments designed to break him without breaking. The man who watched the entire Brotherhood of Darkness detonate itself at Ruusan, and didn't flinch, just started building. The man who trained Zannah across 20 years, knowing with complete clarity that the outcome of that training, if it succeeded, would eventually be his own death. The man who documented every piece of knowledge he possessed in a holocron before the final confrontation, as if putting his affairs in order. The text supports a reading of Bane as motivated by ideology rather than self-preservation at every stage of the trilogy. The essence transfer attempt, examined through the logic of the rule itself rather than through the surface reading, looks like something different from cowardice. If the attempt succeeds, if Bane's consciousness displaces Zannah's and he continues inside her body, then the Sith who persists into the next generation carries Bane's full accumulated knowledge, plus Zannah's trained capability, plus whatever dark side potential she had developed over 20 years of direct instruction. The lineage would be, by any measurable standard, stronger. An extreme application of the rule's evolutionary logic, arrived at through unconventional means, but coherent with the rule's stated purpose of continuous power accumulation. If the attempt fails, if Zannah is powerful enough to perceive the intrusion, resist it, and expel it, she has demonstrated that she can defeat Bane's maximum effort, not merely his lightsaber, not merely his physical capability in an aging body, but his force will applied at its highest achievable concentration. The attempt's failure, under this reading, is the rule's selection mechanism operating at maximum resolution. She wins by proving she can defeat everything he has. The duel's philosophical validity is restored precisely because he committed everything to it. Bane designed the rule to select for the strongest. An essence transfer attempt that fails does exactly that. One that succeeds does that too, by a different route. The method doesn't break the rule's internal logic. It applies that logic past the point where the conventional reading is comfortable following it. The final duel between Bane and Zannah takes place on Ambria in 980 BBY. The Wikipedia entry for the duel on Ambria confirms both the location and the date with specificity. A duel between the Sith Master Darth Bane and his apprentice, Darth Zanna, took place on the planet Ambria in 980 BBY. Ambria, not Done. Done appears separately in Dynasty of Evil as the location for a thread involving Sarah, the daughter of Caleb the Healer, a character who first appeared on Ambria in Path of Destruction. Sarah's story runs through a significant portion of Dynasty of Evil, and connects to the circumstances surrounding Bane's physical condition leading up to the finale. But the climactic confrontation between master and apprentice returns to the planet where the lineage began. Karpyshyn brought the succession crisis back to Ambria deliberately. The Rule of Two started on this world, with a girl whose dark side potential Bane had recognized and decided was enough to build a civilization around. The Rule of Two's first succession, and its first philosophical failure, resolves here as well. Ambria in the Bane novels isn't hospitable terrain. Path of Destruction introduces it through Caleb's presence, a healer living in isolation on a world with a dark side wound in its historical record, the kind of planet where force-sensitive individuals come when they need distance from galactic civilization. Whatever the emotional register of the final confrontation, the geography isn't neutral. This is the founding site returning as the crisis site. 20 years of the Rule of Two's history, closing on the place where it started. Bane initiates the essence transfer ritual against Zannah. The contest operates at the level of pure force presence and will, Bane projecting his consciousness towards Zannah's body, attempting to displace her mind and assume her as a vessel. The mechanics he'd extracted from Andedu's holocron required the host to be viable, but not capable of repelling the intrusion. Against Zannah specifically, his own creation, trained under his direct instruction across 20 years, shaped by everything he knew, the calculation cuts both ways simultaneously. She knows everything he taught her, which means she knows him completely, knows how he thinks, knows the signature of his force presence at its most aggressive. He knows everything she is, which means he knows exactly what he's attempting to overcome, and exactly where she might find the interior leverage to push back. The battle resolves. Dynasty of Evil closes. Karpyshyn then includes a single detail that has generated more analytical argument than nearly anything else in the trilogy. The character who walks away from the duel makes a small, involuntary physical movement. A hand twitch. Unexplained. Offered without commentary. The book ends. Whose consciousness is in that body? The most immediate reading, the one a significant number of readers arrived at, was that Bane won. That the involuntary movement signals a residual consciousness that doesn't quite belong in the body where it's now operating, like a person settling into a house that wasn't built for them, the muscle memory of the original occupant surfacing in an unguarded moment. Under that reading, the downstream implications cascade across 9 centuries of subsequent Sith history. Cognis, trained by the vessel Bane now inhabited, would have been trained by Bane. The next Sith Lord after Cognis, trained by Cognis, would trace their formation back to Bane's continuing presence. Every link in the chain between Ambria and the final Sith Lords, Tenebris, Plagueis, Sidious, would carry the imprint of a single consciousness cycling through successive bodies, training extensions of itself, finally producing Darth Sidious and Order 66 and the Galactic Empire. 1,000 years of different names, different faces, different titles. One continuous identity managing its own perpetuation through the very succession mechanism it had designed for the opposite purpose. Not the Rule of Two producing escalating generational power through distinct successors, but one man accumulating successively better vessels across a millennium. Every Sith Lord history records between 980 BBY and the fall of the Republic becomes, under this reading, an alias. The galaxy-shaping events attributed to a lineage of distinct practitioners were the product of one architect running an extraordinarily long continuity project on Sith philosophy itself. The Sithari, who was supposed to represent the pinnacle of what the tradition could produce, had simply refused to be replaced by it. Karpyshyn published a clarification on his official website, drewkarpyshyn.com. His words, direct and unambiguous. Zannah won. Bane tried to possess her, and failed. But he wasn't completely destroyed, though how much of him remains is something Karpyshyn chose to leave open. The transfer failed. Zannah is the legitimate Dark Lord of the Sith after Ambria. The hand twitch isn't conquest, it's contamination. a trace of Bane's consciousness persisting inside Zannah without controlling her, the residue of a failed attempt rather than the signal of a successful one. Karpyshyn confirmed the outcome while refusing to define the magnitude of the residue, how significant it was, whether it shaped Zannah's decisions in the years following Ambria, whether it passed in some attenuated form to Cognos when Zannah propagated the lineage forward. His second statement on the same page made the authorial intent explicit. He knew there was a lot of confusion about the ending, that he was trying to be subtle and imply something, and that a lot of people were inferring something completely different than what he intended. He wrote the ambiguity as a structural feature, not an accident of execution. The hand twitch is a question encoded in a physical gesture, planted on the novel's final pages precisely because it can't be answered with the tools the novel provides. Karpyshyn confirmed the result. He left the philosophical implications open. The residue of Bane's consciousness inside Zannah, the exact quantity and influence of whatever didn't get expelled, remains unanswered on purpose. Zannah 1. Now apply the rule of two's stated evolutionary logic to that victory, and the philosophical problem reasserts itself at full force. She challenged Bane at the point of his physical deterioration, on a timeline she controlled and calibrated across 2 decades. Dynasty of Evil states the deterioration explicitly, written directly into the text as the conditions surrounding the duel, not as context the reader has to reconstruct from implication. The succession certifies her as stronger than a compromised Bane. Not stronger than the Sith Lord who stood alone at Ruusan, surveyed the smoking ruins of an entire Sith order, and decided to build something better from scratch. Stronger than an aging, physically deteriorating version of that man. The standard she established at Ambria became the inherited benchmark. Darth Cognos, Zannah's apprentice, the next confirmed link in the chain, is described in subsequent lore as a staunch adherent to Bane's doctrines. This detail carries weight. The second generation of the Rule of Two lineage had already identified its philosophical anchor as running through Bane, effectively bypassing the successor who had just completed the first formal succession. Between Cognos and Darth Tenebris, the confirmed lineage includes additional Sith Lords whose individual histories can be compressed without losing the central thread. The rule's outward mechanics held across those centuries. One master, one apprentice. The apprentice eventually kills the master. The form persisted. Darth Tenebris trained Darth Plagueis. Plagueis trained Darth Sidious, Sheev Palpatine, who executed Order 66 in 19 BBY and declared the Galactic Empire. The Rule of Two's final and most consequential succession produced the transformation of the Republic into an empire built on the systematic annihilation of the Jedi Order. How Sidious killed Plagueis is documented. He murdered his master while Plagueis slept. A master killed in his sleep isn't a master who lost a direct test of power against a stronger opponent at the master's full capability. The succession that produced the architect of Order 66 shares the structural logic of what Zannah did at Ambria, a deliberate removal at a moment of vulnerability, efficient rather than dominant, the selection of favorable conditions rather than the direct confrontation the rule's evolutionary premise was built around. Whether that parallel represents the rule's inevitable natural drift over 1,000 years of application, or a downstream echo of the corrupted standard Zannah introduced at the first succession, isn't something the novels answer definitively. What they establish with clarity is the chain. Every name in that lineage traces back to the duel on Ambria, 980 BBY, and to a succession that, by the rule's own internal logic, may not have proven what the rule was designed to require it to prove. The prosecutorial case in its clearest form. Darth Bane designed the Rule of Two to produce an escalating Sith lineage through a succession mechanism that selected for the strongest practitioner each generation. Each duel was meant to function as proof. The new Dark Lord is more powerful than the one they replaced. Bane's attempt to use essence transfer in the final duel wasn't a violation of that mechanism. It was the mechanism applied at maximum intensity, requiring Zannah to defeat not just Bane's lightsaber, but his will and his final gambit. She defeated it. On those terms, the rule's selection process functioned. But the duel doesn't exist in isolation from the conditions surrounding it. Bane's explicitly documented deterioration, Zannah's 20-year delay, her pre-succession recruitment of Cognis before completing her own succession. Together, these constitute a pattern that separates what actually happened at Ambria from what the Rule of Two was designed to produce. Zannah didn't challenge Bane when she judged herself equal to him at his best. She challenged him when the gap between her current capability and his declining capability made the outcome calculable. The rule was designed to select for power. Zannah selected for probability. Those are different things. And from the first succession forward, every Sith who inherited the title did so under the second definition, while claiming the authority of the first. Karpyshyn wrote on his website that he built Dynasty of Evil's ending to imply something specific, watched a significant portion of his readership infer something completely different, and confirmed the outcome while deliberately leaving the philosophical magnitude of the residue unanswered. That's the architecture of a writer who knew exactly what question he was planting on his final pages. The hand twitch isn't a loose end. It's a question Karpyshyn encoded in a physical gesture, because the text can't answer it, and because the answer, depending on its content, changes what 1,000 years of Sith history actually was. Darth Bane appeared in the Clone Wars Season 6, the Lost Missions arc, voiced by Mark Hamill, the actor who played Luke Skywalker, the last Jedi to face the Sith lineage Bane built. Yoda ultimately determines in that arc that the spirit he encounters isn't the genuine Bane, but a dark side construct, a manifestation generated by the dark side to test him, rather than an actual surviving consciousness. Even in the animated canon, the Bane who persists in cultural memory turns out to be a distortion of the original, a version built to serve a purpose, not to represent the actual thing. Karpyshyn's 3 novels remain the actual thing, the record of a man who built the most sophisticated organizational philosophy in Sith history, and a lineage whose first succession may have quietly broken it from the inside. The argument for a full animated adaptation of the Bane trilogy comes back around every few years in Star Wars circles, and the creative question it raises is worth asking directly. Faithful adaptation of all 3 novels, Path of Destruction through Dynasty of Evil, The Gloomwalkers on Kashyyyk and Fasira, The Founding Moment on Ambria, The Hand Twitch, gives Karpyshyn's complete philosophical argument its proper visual form. A continuation set after Ambria, exploring what Bane's residual trace inside Zanna actually meant for the lineage that followed, answers the question he deliberately left open in the text. Both options are interesting. They're interesting because Karpyshyn built something in 2006, 2007, and 2009 that sustains this level of argument 15 years after the final novel came out. Drop your answer in the comments. Faithful adaptation of the 3 novels, or a continuation that picks up after Ambria? And subscribe if Legends analysis at this level is what you're here for.